So for this Global Protect VPN example, I'm using a really simple topology. So I have a firewall and then I have two interfaces. So on the left, you have a LAN interface, and then on the right, you have a WAN interface. So typically in production, the WAN interface would have a public IP, but because I'm using this on a lab, I'm just using a private IP. So just pretend this is a public IP for now. So our scenario is we have a user who is working remotely. So the user need to use Global Protect VPN to connect back to the firewall and then access the web server on 192.168.10.10. So at the moment I have two interfaces as you seen on the diagram. So the LAN and the WAN. So for the Global Protect, you also need to create a tunnel interface. So I already created one called tunnel.1. So you can give it a name, assign it to a security zone. So we are using a zone called VPN, and then assign it to a virtual router. And then you don't need to have an IP. So you don't need to configure an IP for the tunnel, for this tunnel interface. And then for the security zones, I have the LAN and WAN, and then I also created a new zone called VPN, and then I added the tunnel.1 interface into it. So you don't necessarily need to create a new zone, but if you have a separate zone for the VPN, it would be much easier to create and manage the security policies. So the first thing that we need to do regarding Global Protect VPN is to create or import a server-side certificate. So if you are using this in production or for your own company, ideally you want to go to a public certificate authority and then ask them for a certificate. But because I'm using this in a lab, I'm going to use a self-signed certificate. So the problem with the self-signed is by default, the clients trust all the public CA certificate. So when you try to connect to the Global Protect VPN, everything will just work. But because we are using a self-signed certificate, by default, the client won't trust the certificate. So you might get an error saying the certificate is not trusted. So you will need to import the certificate back into the client. So I will show you that in a minute. So you need to generate two certificates. So first you need to create a root CA, and then you need to create the server certificate, which you will use it with Global Protect. So just click generate, and then the name, you can just give it any name. So root CA1, and then root CA1, it doesn't really matter. But the important thing for the CA certificate is you need to put a tick for the certificate authority and then just click generate. And then for the actual server certificate, you need to click generate again, and then the name, you can say VPN cert1, and the common name has to be an IP address or the FQDN of the outside interface. Again, in production, ideally you want to use a FQDN, so you need to have an air record on your DNS server. So for example, if your public IP is 1.1.1.1, you will have a DNS entry called vpn.yourcompanyname.com. So when the users connect to the VPN, they will use the FQDN. So again, because I'm just using this in the lab, I will just use the IP, so 10.10.20.36. I believe that's the correct IP. And then, yeah, you don't have to put a tick for CA because this is not a CA. And then for the certificate attributes, you need to have two entries. So for the IP, again, you need to put 10.10.20.36. Let me just double check if that's the correct IP. Yeah, 20.36. And then add another option, the host name, if you have one. So vpn.test.com. And then the important thing is the signed by need to be the CA that you just created, and then click generate. And then now you will have a new CA and the new server certificate that we will use it with the VPN. So once we created the certificate, we need to create a SSL TLS service profile. So go to the SSL TLS service profile, and then you just need to create a new one. So click add, and then give it a name, and then select the certificate you just created. So make sure you don't select the root certificate, so you have to select the actual server certificate. I already created one using my server certificate I created before. So give it a name and then the certificate. So we will need to use the TLS service profile later on the VPN config. So the next step is to create some user accounts. Again, in production, ideally you want to authenticate the users against Active Directory, but just for this example, I'm going to create some local user accounts. So go to the local user database and then users. So here I created a user called Max with the password. And then once you created a user, you go to the authentication profile and then create a new authentication profile. So here I'm calling it GP VPN profile, and the type I selected local database. So again, if you use Active Directory, you can choose LDAP or you can choose Radius, whichever that you're using. And then on the advanced, select all for the allow list. So these are the prereq for the VPN config. So now we can go to network and then global protect. So here you need to create the portal and the gateway. In most scenarios, you will have a single portal and a single gateway in just one firewall. But if you have like a distributed network, you might have a single portal and then multiple gateways. But just for simplicity, I'm going to create a single gateway and then single portal on this single firewall. So go to the gateway, and then I created a new gateway called VPN gateway. So here, if you open the gateway config, you will have 4 different tabs on the left. So we are just going to focus on the first 3. So general, authentication and agent. So give it a name, and then for the network settings, you have to choose the outside interface and the IP. And then for the authentication, here you had to choose the SSL TLS service profile that we created in the earlier step. And then under the client authentication, create a new client authentication profile. So here, just give it a name, and then for operating system, you can choose any. In case if you want to apply, or if you want to have different config for different operating system, then you could do that. So you can say for Mac OS, I want to have a different config. And then authentication profile, this is again we created before using the local database. And then everything else you can just leave it as default. And then if you go under the agent, you will have multiple tabs. So because this is an external gateway, you had to tick the tunnel mode, and then by default the global protect will use IPsec, but I prefer to use SSL, so I uncheck the enable IPsec option. And then here you have to select the tunnel interface that you created before. And then under client settings, you need to create a new client config. And again, you can leave most of them as default. So source user is any, and then source and the operating system is any. So for example, so let's say, so here I'm using an IP pool 192.168.100.0. So when the users connect to the global protect, they will get an IP on this range. So in case if you want the Mac OS users to get let's say one IP, and then Windows users to get a different IP, you can create multiple config. So you can say if the OS is Mac, I want to apply this subnet, and then you could even say I want to use this DNS server. And then instead of OS, you could also say if the user is this Macs, then I want to apply this DNS server, or I want to apply this specific settings. So it's up to you how do you want to do it, but again, for simplicity, I'm just going with any. See, the authentication override, again, you can just leave as default. We are not covering this in this video. And then IP pool, again, this is the IP address the client will receive. And then for split tunnel, if you want to only send the internal traffic to the firewall, and then if you want to send everything else directly to the internet, you can say, okay, include 192.168.10.0/24. So what happens is, if a user is trying to go to the internet, the traffic will not go through the VPN tunnel. So only the subnets that you specify here will go through the internet. If you want to send everything to the tunnel, you can just delete it and leave it empty, but I prefer to put 0000 here, which means everything has to go to the VPN tunnel. And then this option, no direct access to local network. So let's say a user is working from home and their IP is 192.168.1.0, and then they might have a printer on their local network. So if we click no direct access to the local network, the Global Protect client will not allow connection to the printer. So if you want to have the highest security, you can send all the traffic through the tunnel, and then you can also block the direct access to the local network. And then for network services, again, this is the DNS server the Global Protect client will use. And then the client IP pool. So in case if you have multiple client config, and then you want to just use a single IP pool, instead of defining the IP pool on each config, you can remove it from the client setting. So you can delete it from here, and then you can put it globally here. So all the client config will get that IP pool. So same goes to the DNS server. So instead of defining the DNS server individually on each client config, you can just configure it globally. And then for the connection setting, so the login lifetime, I set it to 10 hours. So let's say a user connect to the Global Protect 9 o'clock in the morning. The connection will not disconnect for the first 10 hours. So let's say the user goes on a break and then come back, the connection will still be alive and connected. I think the default is 30 days, which is much longer, but if you want to allow it just for 2 hours, then you can change it. And the inactivity logout is, let's say there is no traffic going through the tunnel for 60 minutes, and then the Global Protect will disconnect the tunnel automatically. So again, you can tweak and tune this setting to suit your need. So that's all we need to do on the gateway side. And then portal, so more or less the portal has similar config. So let's go to the portal, and again you will have multiple tabs on the left, but we are only focusing on general, authentication, and an agent. So general, again, select your WAN interface and the IP. Everything else you can just leave at default. And then for authentication, similar to what we done before, select the SSL TLS profile. Again, client authentication is same, select the same authentication profile. And then for agent, so you have the option to add the trusted root CA. So this is a root CA that we created on the first step, and then you can also tick this box. So when the clients connect the first time, the Global Protect client will install the root certificate onto the client machine. And on the agent config, again, you can leave most of them as default, so you don't really have to do anything here. Same here, just leave everything any, and then we are not using internal gateway. So for the external gateway, just add the gateway that we created before. So usually you just put your name and the IP or FQDN. So I added the gateway that we created before. So the app tab, we didn't see it in the gateway. You will only see it under the portal. So you can configure a lot of stuff here. So for example, so this option allow user to disable Global Protect app. So if I allow it, the users can just disable Global Protect, or you have the option to disallow or allow with the command. And then again, this option allow the user to uninstall Global Protect app, and then only in Windows. Again, you can allow it to block it, and then you can go through and then you can tweak and tune to suit your needs. I think one thing I forgot to mention is on the certificate. So when you created the certificate, because this is a self-signed certificate, when the user try to connect to the Global Protect VPN, it might not work. You might get an error saying the certificate is not trusted. So what you need to do is you need to export the root CA. So if you can export it from here, import, export, and then just click OK, and then it will download the certificate to locally on your computer, and then just click on it, and then open, and then click install certificate. You can choose either current user or local machine, and then place all certificates in the following store, and then select trusted root certificate authorities, and then click next, and then click finish. But I already done it, so I'm just going to click cancel. So that's all for now. So if we go back to our diagram, so our goal is the user should be able to access 192.168.10.10. So if I try to connect now without connecting to the VPN, so HTTP 192.168.10.10, it will not work. So let me try to connect to the VPN now. So because I already connected to the VPN with the username and password, it is not asking me to put the username and password again. So it says it's connected now. So if you go to setting, you can see I'm connected. I have 9 hours remaining, because remember we put 10 hours as the lifetime, and this is my IP address. So this is the IP address we configured under the IP pool. So let me try now. So HTTP 192.168.10.10, and then yeah, it works. So if I try to go to internet, because we are using full tunnel, our traffic is going to the firewall and then going to the internet from there. So yeah, that's all for the Global Protect VPN.